Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Daniel Tunkelang, who is one of the top search relevance consultants in the United States. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Pleasure to be here.
So, Daniel, you have worked with an A-list of clients. I mean, on LinkedIn, you got Apple, Etsy, a whole list of impressive companies, name brand companies that you've helped on search. Tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do.
So I've had the good fortune of working the full stack of how search engines work. When I was really my first real job out of school was helping to build a company called Endeca that really changed the shape of search for e-commerce companies, doing something called faceted search. And when I was there, I helped build the initial engine, worked on research and development. And because it was a startup, I got to touch a little bit of everything from sales to intellectual property to marketing and so forth. And the nice thing about that is that now when I work as a consultant, I can go into companies and I can help them with everything from understanding their strategic roadmap to helping with tactical decisions like trying to figure out what the words in each search query mean and different AI techniques for doing that. So it's a lot of fun, and it is, while very specific to search discovery recommendations, but it's a bit of a niche area. But what I found is that I end up having to work across the full stack of those areas.
Okay, so just to be clear to folks, we're not talking so much about showing up in Google search results, right? You're working on to give us a sense of the range of types of search that you're working for. So you mentioned e-commerce. So if I'm on an e-commerce site and I type in like shirts or blue shirts or something, you'd help figure out like what blue shirts it's going to show me, I imagine. But like, what are the different things that you work, the different kind of search bars or search tools you work on?
Sure. So you're right. This is typically site search, which is to say the search boxes that you find on websites, as opposed to the search engine in something like a Google or Bing. I did work at Google in the past, but yeah, as you can imagine, a lot of other people need search to work for them, and that's especially important for retailers, where search is typically the main avenue by which they sell things, but also for folks who, for example, are doing staffing or helping people connect with information, services, documents, and so forth. So these are proprietary collections of documents or products, usually large numbers of them, that their users have some value in finding.
Okay, so let's walk through maybe a case example. Um, this is something that maybe just is almost invisible or not something that I really think about too much. But if I go to a e-commerce website and I type in a term, how is that website deciding what products to show me? Is it be context specific, like it sort of knows something about me already, so based on that it's deciding what it's going to show? Different people would see different things for the same term. Just tell me a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes.
Sure. So one of the interesting things about search is that it's maybe the only part of your interaction with the internet, with machines, where you pretty much say what you want, right? This isn't like going to a social media site that largely feeds you what it thinks you want to see or what it wants you to see for some other reason. With search, you come in, you express an intent through a few words in the search box, and you get stuff back. So a good search engine tries pretty hard to listen to what it is you're asking for. So the query itself is the main signal. So let's say you go in and you look for blue shirts. Then the simplest thing it could do would be to say, well, let me find the products that have the word blue and the word shirts in them, get them back in some order. Now, even there's a lot of room to do better than that. For example, recognizing that shirts are a product type, that blue is a color, and the inventory hopefully knows the difference between, for any particular item in the catalog, what is its product type and what is its color, and is able to match those accordingly. So that kind of both structure in the index and analysis of what you typed in to figure out not just what words they are, but a little bit more about what they mean, allows the search engine to do a better job of matching relevant inventory. And by the way, part of the advantage is not just saying to make sure that it's blue the color and shirt the product type, but to realize that maybe blue also includes turquoise, and maybe shirts also includes, if it's women's shirts, things like blouses, chemises, and so forth, right? So a lot of this work is just to get the relevant matching inventory. But for a search query like blue shirts, there are a ton of them. So there's the issue of which ones to show. And at that point, depending on how well the search engine is done at returning only relevant results, there may still be a factor of saying, well, part of the way it's going to order the results it returns to you is going to be prioritizing relevant ones. My own preference is that it's not an issue of prioritizing relevant ones, it's only returning relevant ones, but that can be challenging. And so there's the issue of trying to get things that are relevant. And then, we're talking about e-commerce here, there's a desire to return things that you're more likely to buy, things that will convert. And so the scoring that the search engine does is a mixture of factors that have to do with relevance and factors that have to do with the likelihood that something will convert. Now, you asked at the beginning, well, is it going to be something for you personally? That depends. A search engine has to work even for a new user. And for new users, you have no history to go on. You might know something, right? Like if you're looking for blue shirts and right now you're in a part of the country or world that's cold versus hot, that's information that could be used to prioritize, for example, short sleeve versus long sleeve shirts. And there may be other factors that can be considered. If you bought things before on the site and you're logged in, which the search engine may know because of a cookie or because you're literally logged in, say because you're using an app, then it might try to show you things that you've bought before, similar brands and so forth. And those are factors that can influence it. So there's a lot in play. And these things tend to matter mostly when you have very large sets of matching inventory. So what you show matters. There's even more things like trying to show a diverse set of results to hedge its bets and make it clear that there's a variety of inventory, showing you different ways to slice and dice. This is actually the work that I did at this company in DECA, which was saying, look, returning a ranked list of results doesn't necessarily satisfy the user. If I look for shirts, you just don't know enough to know whether I want t-shirts, dress shirts, even men's shirts or women's shirts if you don't know who I am. So there's a navigation element of this to help me find that parts of the inventory, much like if I were in a store, I would go to the right department. And I talk about this in e-commerce, but this applies more broadly to search problems against large and varied inventory.
So is there technology, or is there certain behind the scenes software providers? So are companies typically building this from the bottom up? Do they grab some open source software, or are there vendors providing, are there sort of three big vendors that provide a search tool for website search? Like, what's powering these different searches?
So there's a mix. There are certainly some companies that build things completely from scratch. Those tend to be the really big technology companies. So companies like Google or Amazon, Facebook build their own search. And that makes sense. They're at a scale where even a tiny improvement that is specific to their use cases is worth the army of people they have to build it. The next level down from that tend to be people who work with an open source platform, and the dominant platform is based on Apache Lucene. And there are a few companies that have really established themselves as building on top of this. The two most known being Elastic and LucidWorks, which had some of the developers. And what you see there are often, I mean, there are some companies that will use these things, the platform pretty much as is, but because it's open source, there's a lot of ability to tinker with it. And so the larger companies, not at the scale of a Google or an Amazon, but at the scale of some of the largest retailers, are more likely to take that approach. Then you start to see a level down from that, folks that use managed search, and they typically don't really want the full responsibility of developing the software. They'd like something more like a service, but and they're willing to sacrifice having as much control over it as if they were developing themselves. And a big advantage there is a lower operational cost. And then finally, I'd say that the simplest folks are using the search that comes with the other platform they're using. So perhaps they're using an e-commerce platform and search is built in, or they're using some kind of content management system and search is built in. It's free to them, but generally they don't know how it works. They don't want to know. They know they have to have a search box, but they don't want to invest any more than they have to into it. So I'd say that's the spectrum that I've seen in terms of technology.
I'd like to walk through a few examples of the types of projects that you do. Could you pick one, sanitize it, and walk through an example of, when do you get called in, at what stage, and then what's your process? What's the stages of your work?
Sure. I mean, as you said, I'll have to sanitize examples, not to name particular names, but I can talk about the sort of the problems that people bring me in for. One company recently knew that it had problems with spelling correction, and they had done a little bit of analysis to see what the extent of their problem was. But they were about to dive into let's just say sort of an AI approach to this, build deep neural networks, collect lots of training data. And it's nice, but for the retailer and for the size of their team and the folks they had, this really didn't make sense. Unfortunately, the head of that team had been told that, hey, talk to this consultant. And so when I talked to them, I asked them to share with me, the kinds of logs of queries that they had, and it became clear that a large fraction of their misspellings were relatively close to popular queries. So knowing that, I was able to say, look, here's an approach that could solve maybe half of your problem in a few weeks, as opposed to the effort you're embarking on, which could easily be months or even past a year to develop. And so I worked with them to show them the opportunity to give essentially a very early sort of proof of concept of what this might look like, enough for their engineering team to take it from there. And so that's a nice sort of tactical example. Maybe at the other extreme, I've had folks come in and say, look, we know our search is primitive, help us. Now, that's a little bit more open-ended, obviously. So there, what I typically do is start with what I call a search experience audit. Right, that's something where I go, I look at the way every kind of user-facing aspect of the site works, the way that they're handling long queries, short queries, different kinds of synonyms, the way that they autocomplete in the search bar, what happens if you sort by price, for example, versus sorting by relevance. And I write up a report of how I see the gaps relative to benchmarks, and often those start to suggest potential solutions. For example, if it's easy to return no results, that's often because they need to be able to take longer queries and drop tokens or drop words from them, or maybe they aren't recognizing synonyms, or compound words aren't being broken up in various ways. So this is really kind of a very crude opportunity analysis just from the user perspective. And then if they'll share query logs with me, I'll start analyzing those, because amazingly, a lot of folks with search engines don't have much of a picture of how searchers use their site. So for example, in some sites I've found that they were worried about understanding natural language queries, but the overwhelming majority of their queries were only 1 or 2 words, and surprising number of those queries had a mixture of letters and numbers in them, which turned out to be identifiers. And they had a particular problem when people would use identifiers that were no longer active on their site, a problem they could easily address just by keeping a history of them and then having some way of saying, oh, we don't have that item anymore, but here are similar items, or whatever it might be. Or in other cases where they would type in these identifiers, but the spaces would be different, or the hyphens, or whatever it might be. Again, something that they could address. So this would be more of analysis of behavior. And then I'll look at the technical architecture to see if there are things they're doing that's clearly at odds with best practices. And so I've done that for a number of companies, either as just the entirety of an engagement, so give them an overview of where they stand, or as the introduction. So I say, okay, well, let's do this, and then you'll know what's up, and then this can be the beginning of a longer relationship where I'm helping them fix it, or guidance for how they work with their own teams or other partners. It depends, but as with all things, you can't really start solving problems until you know what the problems are.
Yeah, I love it. For the search experience audit, do you have a kind of a diagnostic guide or a template that you start with every time, or you kind of custom create it? Talk to me about that a bit.
What I'd say is, like when I do this with folks, I try to find a recent example of something I've done in their space, right? If it's about retail, a lot of retailers have extremely similar goals and similar problems on sites. So I've alluded to, for example, like looking at the autocomplete and long queries, and query relaxation, query expansion, spelling correction. There's a list. In fact, I've written a blog called Query Understanding that tries to walk through the life cycle of what happens to search queries, which is, in my view, often the most neglected part of what people have done when they've developed search applications, and then a variety of things with relevance. And so I'd say the problems tend to be similar across. Unfortunately, it's not something where you can just point a machine at a site and do these things, because the notion of what it is to find something relevant, the notion of how you would back off from something, or what a conversion is, those are a bit idiosyncratic for each site. Like I worked with one retailer where they had a lot of items that cost thousands, in some cases even over $1 million. In a site like that, you can't say, well, let's optimize for a conversion. Nobody just does a search, finds $1 million piece of jewelry, and clicks buy it now. I've also worked with customers where with retailers that have an in-store and online offering, and so they know that some of the things that people find online they'll buy in the stores, and in particular those tend to be things that are either more expensive or larger and therefore more expensive to ship. So what I've seen is that I do need to learn a little bit about each customer just to even do a reasonable job of helping them in the space. With that said, I think a lot of the product, technical, and sort of user experience challenges, they tend to show up just in slightly different form for everyone. It's exciting when I find that somebody has a new issue, but I think that search is one of these universal activities, and all the stories are out there. You just have to match the details to that story.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what other types of findings you've had from looking at these search queries that have been surprising to the executives in the business, if not to you. You mentioned a few, like people searching on the product ID. I mean, which is kind of a natural thing. I've certainly done that lots of times. People searching on getting like no search results. What are some of the other things that you've found by digging into those search queries?
Other fun examples. One was where someone was using frequent searches to power what they showed for search suggestions when you were typing, sort of autocomplete. And I said, these look funny to me. And when I dug in, my first impulse was that, well, they weren't strictly using the frequencies. They were also using some other measures. So I threw all that away. I said, just search by what if you did it sorting just by how frequent they were? And they still looked weird. And it was one of these moments where I said, look, I don't like arguing with data, but I think the data is wrong. And a little bit of investigation turned out that they were getting a lot of traffic from bots, so automated scraping traffic, and they knew about this, and they even were removing that traffic from some parts of their accounts, but not from the ones being used to power these completions. And once those are removed, actually the frequencies look pretty reasonable. It was funny because as somebody who's called myself a data scientist, I don't usually like saying my opinion is right and the data is wrong. But it was a case where I'm glad I stuck to my guns and found the issue in the data. Another example of that is surprising to me, I think, as well as to the client, is that a typical thing people do when they have search engines is the moment you type something in, they convert it all to lowercase, regardless of whether you typed in uppercase or lowercase. And that's used for matching and so forth. Nobody types in proper names with capitals into search engines unless it's done automatically. But it turns out that you often do find capital letters in the search logs. And the reason you find them is that people copy and paste from one site to search on another. If they're, say, comparison shopping, there may be other reasons, like searching for a name that they get from elsewhere. And those searches often are quite different than the searches they would have typed otherwise. And in the case of people who are shopping, they often have very specific intent. If you don't sort of handle those well, they're often very long queries. They may have punctuation or all sorts of things that mess up your search engine because you didn't plan for them. And so those are the things that those kinds of discoveries, like finding that a search query is a mixture of capitalized, lowercase, punctuation, so forth. Once you find them, you look for them everywhere. But what I found is that by virtue of my working with so many different companies with their various search logs, I've picked up all of these cases and sort of thrown them in my bag of tricks. But folks who've been one place for too long, they've discovered some of them, but not all of them. And so I find that part of my job is effectively socializing that list of problems people run into.
So what happens if a client calls you up and says, hey, we don't know exactly what the problem is, but we just think that our search could be improved. We'd like to see if our search could be improved, like e-commerce, right? If we could improve our search and that would increase revenue, would you I mean, I suppose you would do the audit, and then would you start just experimenting and trying out different things, or how would you go about actually finding out what is going to be the highest impact?
Well, part of this is sort of interrogating them as to what they understand of their problems. So, for example, uh, if I ask, well, why do you think your search could be better? Are people complaining? Do people inside find those? Is the problem that people do searches and get no results, or they see that there are good results, but they're not ranked very well? I try to tease out even why it is that they think there's room for improvement. To be clear, almost everybody has some room for improvement, but a little bit more specificity helps. And usually people have some intuitions around that. Then I play with the site myself to get both my own intuitions and to validate those that they have. Now at that point, it's still all anecdotal, although it doesn't take long to figure out, for example, that a site doesn't do spelling correction or is highly sensitive to whether you put singular or plural words or things like that. I mean, some things you can find out from one or two examples. Other things don't show themselves so easily. But the what I then would do once I'm actually engaging with a customer is to say, look, if you have problems you've already committed to solving, I can help you tactically with coming up with the best solutions for them. If you're trying to figure out how to prioritize what problems to solve, I can help you frame them in terms of things like improving relevance, improving recall, that is making sure you actually show the stuff that you have, improving the efficiency of the searcher's journey through your site, whatever it might be. Quantify those things so that we have sort of a way of measuring those, and then look to see, in fact, where you stand on those with your current search. I mean, part of this is also finding out what it is that they are tracking. I've seen, for example, people with search engines that they only track when users click on something. And so you learn nothing about searches where users don't click. That's can be a bit challenging. The first thing there is to say, look, you need to do a bit of a better job of instrumenting your site so that we can see what's going on. Fortunately, off-the-shelf tools tend to do a fair amount of this automatically. So I learn a lot from their logs, and even just seeing different breakdowns of the kinds of queries that are frequent often makes it easier to see what's going on. But I mean, what I basically say is, look, you can give me a month of what your users are searching for, whether or not they clicked on those searches, whether or not they bought something, what positions, the stuff that tends to be fairly raw in their logs. Then by looking at different cuts of that, I can get a pretty good idea of what the problems are, especially if I sort of couple that with playing around on the site. And I can go back and forth between gaining intuition from sort of anecdotal examples and then validating that intuition through a more rigorous analysis of their data.
So you've talked some about the maybe kind of more visible or legible parts of a website that someone who is not necessarily technical could be looking at as well. What are you also looking at the more kind of technical infrastructure sides that kind of into the kind of computer, the back end, the database piece of that?
So what happens, the nice thing about search is it's such a human thing. So in terms of the product problems, those generally do surface to people. And if they don't, you don't really have to worry about them. Where the technology comes in is when you're trying to solve them. So for example, let's say I notice that a lot of the results coming back are in the wrong category. So then I start to say, well, what kind of structured data is associated with these elements? Do you have a way of mapping or classifying the search queries to those, which is often a classifier you'd build using machine learning. If you are building such a thing, what does the pipeline look like for doing that? So, I mean, the solutions to the problems or the causes of the problems certainly live within that back end, and they either have to do with whether data is being collected, if that's what kind of analytical or machine learning pipeline that's being thrown into, and so forth. I try to catch the sort of the head of the problem where it's user visible and chase it to the back. But one of the things that I've seen with search architectures, they're very deep very often, right? Like it's content comes in, it gets joined to a variety of other sources. There's the way the sausage is made can be pretty complicated. So one of the things I've learned is that if I want to have impact on someone quickly, I try to either catch content immediately on the way in, when it's kind of in its least processed form, or do things like, say, catch queries on their way in and work with those, because in the middle it tends to be the hardest to make changes. So the short answer is yes, I look at the various pieces of the stack, but I try to think end to end of the user problems or content problems. And as I said, if those aren't visible, they probably don't matter.
Let's talk about a project that you've done. You mentioned that you've also worked on search for staffing type situations. Could you give us an example of how search is used there and the type of work that you've done with that sort of problem?
Sure. I can actually talk about, even before as I was doing consulting, I spent about 4.5 years at LinkedIn, where I ran search, and there, you'd see a variety of things. You have maybe the most conventional use of people typing in someone's name, which you think would be really easy, but bear in mind they might type in the first name. You might not know they're typing in a name, and so forth. So that was kind of a fun problem. But also, we wanted to make sure that when people would look for a software engineer, they still find people who call themselves software developers, or if I look for an architect, I probably mean a software architect. But my wife, who works with folks in real estate, actually means real architects. And so in a situation like that, you have a mixture of trying to tease out the various parts of the search query, but then also matching that to the right elements in this kind of semi-structured data, expanding it, and so forth. And ultimately, in the case of LinkedIn, not that different from the way a staffing application would work, you're measuring your success not just by whether people click on the results, but by ultimately whether they engage with the people or jobs that they find. I think that I've worked with other folks in the space, companies more in freelance marketplace like Upwork and Fiverr, and there you get lots of additional factors coming into play. Sometimes a bit of an imbalance between the supply and the demand. You want to make sure that new entrants to the marketplace get enough exposure, but you tend to have a lot more signal about the older entrants. It's also because it's a two-sided market. You don't want a handful of players in that market, getting more attention than they know what to do with, while everybody else is being starved. In this sense, it's kind of like dating sites. You don't want the same few people getting all the attention, because that actually doesn't optimize for anyone. But ultimately, if you're trying to hire someone or you're trying to find jobs, You kind of come in, you describe what you're looking for. You probably describe it in only a couple of words, which isn't enough to do this. And then you have a bunch of results that you want to slice and dice through. It's not that different than shopping.
I'm a big user of LinkedIn, and I have a question about LinkedIn search. So, LinkedIn search could offer much more functionality than it does. Even if you're a premium user, even if you have Sales Navigator, there's a fairly limited number of dimensions you can search on, and there's a lot that you cannot. You can't say search on, oh, I only want to look at people with like more than 500 connections, or I only want to look at people that have added 100, more than 100 connections in the last month or two, or have updated their profile recently because they're looking for a job, or I want to only look for people with a PhD in chemical engineering. So what, if to the degree you can share, that's not under NDA, like what's the thinking behind limiting that capability and only exposing, kind of a subset of fields?
So a few things. I left LinkedIn in 2015, so my knowledge is probably a little bit stale, although I stay very friendly with folks there. First, the most expensive product which you can get from LinkedIn for hiring is the recruiter seats, and those do have more power. I don't remember which of the things you listed that they do or don't support, but I do know that the enterprise recruiter users have a more expressive search functionality than the more consumer, even premium users. So if you have the budget for that, that's certainly something you can always explore. But beyond that, the funny thing is people, power users particularly, right, will say, oh, I want all these knobs. But then the overwhelming majority of people don't use those knobs, or even if they do, they don't necessarily use them well. I'll give you an example. At one point, somebody said, only, I forget what it was, but it's only some small percentage of LinkedIn users have college degrees. I heard this and I said, that's ridiculous. I mean, we knew at the time that LinkedIn skewed very heavily towards more educated users. And I don't know what the exact numbers were, but certainly the overwhelming majority went to college. But what happened was that in order to, first off, not everybody fills out their profiles just because, they may be lazy about it. In the past, you pretty much had a giant form to fill out, but then as part of supporting growth, a variety of folks made that experience easier. So it was easier to create a LinkedIn profile with less information. Then when you were asked what college you went to, you were asked what year did you graduate. Not everybody was so thrilled about putting their graduation year on their profile. And at the time, you couldn't put where you went to college, so you just didn't put it. Now, someone looking at that data and concluding that most people who went to LinkedIn, most LinkedIn users didn't go to college, is just not understanding how the data was created. But if you have a field you expose that says went to college or not, it doesn't necessarily have an asterisk saying, by the way, a lot of our users don't bother to put this information on there. And so this is a big problem with sophisticated interfaces, is that they will run into problems with missing data, dirty data, or there were people, for example, who were moderating groups on Facebook, and they said Facebook moderator, and the next thing you knew, they showed up as Facebook employees. Job position, moderator. Not really what you're looking for. So I think all of those kinds of issues, not just at LinkedIn, but in general, have pushed search towards people saying, look, I should just be able to put a few words in the search box like Google and find what I'm looking for. It turns out that as you're reacting, it's like, well, that's not quite enough. But there's a tension between exposing the all the sort of fine-tuning knobs, the ability to do full Boolean expressions or even joins. I mean, there are people who pretty much want to have the same access to something like LinkedIn as they would to a relational database. And that the minority of users, but they're loud. And then at the other extreme, you have the majority of users who type in sales and they expect to find the salespeople or sales jobs they want. So it's tough navigating that when you're making sort of product prioritization choices. And ideally, you find ways to hedge where you are making it easy for the people who just want to type in a little and being smart about what you can infer, but offering just enough flexibility so that you could say, oh, maybe you should specify the industry or years of experience or whatever it might be. But then there's also just the business aspect that, particularly for a company like LinkedIn, the basic product is free, and there are a variety of upsells, but ultimately the people paying the most money are also getting sort of the most functionality for hiring, marketing, and selling to people. And so that's its own set of decisions about what to make available at what price.
I suppose those same principles you just talked about really apply to many other types of search products where some users internally may want more functionality, but then you want to keep it simple enough for the majority of users. Talk to me about how you've handled that in other situations.
So I know that I've had people complain to me, that we should prioritize some search feature they care about, like, support advanced search of some sort, support Boolean expressions, support natural language understanding. And the first thing I do is to say, I looked at the logs and I did find that 0.2% of queries meet the use case you're describing. And so are those really, really important people? Or, are you simply convinced that if we built it, they will come? Now, how aggressively I tell people that will vary, but it's, both when I was an employee and as a consultant, it's my job to speak truth to power in these things and to say, look, you want to meet a real user need, and if there's no evidence for that need in your own traffic, then, or there's minimal evidence for that need, then this is a really big gamble, because changing user behavior is hard, especially when that user behavior doesn't just come from people's familiarity with your site. It comes from the way they've been trained to do search on other sites, which is why, the baseline is people are going to search your site the way they would search Google, the way they would search Amazon, and so forth, because that's most of the time they spend in search boxes. So that's not to say that your data or the use cases you're supporting are the same ones as what Google and Amazon does. There can be a bit of a mismatch there, but your baseline should be that is how your users will behave. So when product managers or engineering leaders get excited about kind of very exotic ways of doing search, I try to push back with a certain skepticism that they would have to market this to their users in order to get them to engage in it. And part of what this often exposes is a lack of familiarity with their own user behavior, which is something that people need to spend more time getting to know, especially in search.
When you yourself are searching on a website as a user of the website, what are some of the things that you do that the rest of us might not know about to do? Or in other words, what are some tips and tricks that you have for all of us on how to search effectively?
I do think that a little bit of advanced search can go a long way. A lot of sites will let you, for example, quote phrases or use minus to negate things. And I would say that it's often worth doing that to get a sense of what's available. I mean, part of the problem is the sort of, unknown problem, right? Anything that's below the first page, you don't really have a sense of what's there. And I think that these kinds of Boolean operators and or not are useful for exploring. I would say in general, um, as much as the people who are building the search engine are trying really hard to make the ranking be for you, they're not in your head. So the more you can express in the query, the more you can control what you're going to get back. Um, I would say also uh, learn what happens with the way that any kind of sorting is done. I found many sites, the moment that you change the sort, they throw any notion of relevance out the window. And in those cases, you may be better off, for example, filtering and using the default sorts that they have rather than using a sort. Sorting by price on an e-commerce site is notorious for this. And many sites, you get complete garbage when you sort by price because you suddenly discover all the irrelevant results that have been included, and you'd been better off kind of doing a binary search, if you will, of different filter values and saying, I don't really want the cheapest one, but I need to find a reasonable range below which I'm still seeing relevant results. Good sites do this for you, but that doesn't mean you can't do it yourself. The other thing is that sometimes you're able to, you find a few good products, and or might not be products, it might be, if you're looking for people, it might be a few good people and so forth. It's worth looking at the words on those and essentially trying to use those to inspire better queries. This is actually something known as I think it was Marcia Bates, called pearl growing, or it's part of information foraging theory. Again, something that the best sites will do some of for you. They'll show you products like this one, or even suggest searches based on a particular page, but it's something you can often do yourself if they don't.
Talk to me about the community of experts like yourself in search, and kind of how you get projects. I imagine that there's not a ton of experts in search out there. So, like, do you kind of know the other players? Do you know most of the folks at companies that are responsible for search? I'm curious about that, just that kind of social network and space of search experts.
Yeah, it's a funny space. I think that what happened in search is that there was a time when search was just very hot as a problem, and then it became replaced by recommendations, data science, AI. And me, I still like search, so I've doubled down on it using machine learning and AI to be sure. But the what happened is that in the academic community, there are a handful of conferences focused on information retrieval and search. A lot of the folks in there are professors, and then you get folks who are researchers at places like Microsoft and Google. It's a nice community. I love these people, and I hope we can have conferences again one of these days. But they're often a little bit detached from the pragmatic problems that most folks are working on in search. There are a handful of industry conferences, but part of the problem there is that they're often organized around vendors, and there really isn't a great vendor neutral gathering. So then you have the online world, and back in '98, back in 2008, when I realized there was a bit of a void there, I started blogging about search problems, and I found that people came to me, even though I was kind of a nobody at that point in the space. But a lot of what I was doing was just taking everything I was learning, the best practices, and putting it in a place that not only would share it with people, but would encourage people to come into comment threads. And I was shocked that some bold-faced names who had worked on search at places like Google and Microsoft were showing up on my blog and putting in comments. Of course, I sort of took advantage of that quickly and got to know them. And what I found is that if you go to these conferences, you put yourself out there, you write, you engage with people. At some point, I'd actually organized a symposium called the Symposium on Human-Computer Information Retrieval. There's definitely work to get to know folks, but it's not that big a community. And I've been lucky to meet a lot of the folks working on it. When I discover people uh, who are doing interesting work, maybe from a conference presentation and so forth, I sometimes just cold call them. Like, look, hey, how have we not run into each other? Which can, you know, I'm sure there are people who receive those kinds of notes from me who've been a little bit thrown by them, but I found that it's a great way to get to know the folks in the space.
And before we wrap, please, where can we find your blog, and what's the best place for people to find you online?
So uh, the nice thing about having a name like Tunkelang is that there's no place for me to hide. If you look me up on Google, you'll get a little knowledge panel, and that will link to a bunch of my stuff. But um, I post most of my writings now on Medium. So my media name is D Tunkelang, and I have a series of posts called Query Understanding, conveniently at queryunderstanding.com, where that really walks through the life cycle there. I have content I've posted on LinkedIn, and even old posts at a blog called The Noisy Channel that is, even though I haven't posted anything new there in several years, I keep the content up because it's a good place for it to live. I also post on Quora. Frankly, like I would say, Medium is probably the best place to look for things, but as I said, Googling my name, you'll find a bunch of this stuff, and can't miss an opportunity for self promotion. But if you really have search problems, feel free to just reach out to me directly. Through LinkedIn, you can just send me messages. I have what's called open link.
And as Daniel said, he shows up in search results. Daniel, we'll include those links in the show notes. It was really great speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Well, thanks for having me.